Tim Adalin, a chemical ecologist. I'm now feeling that I have an understanding of what that means. And I've really enjoyed our dialogues over the last year or so. I've listened to you speak with Matt Segal, who's a philosopher who's been on the channel a number of times. Tremendously informative, very, very generative. And because people may not have heard of the term chemical ecologist before, I'd like to ask you to give a brief synopsis of that. And just by way of introduction as well, I'll say I consider you to be an extremely interesting philosopher. Now, I know you belong to the institutional setup, so you might be quick to say I'm not technically a philosopher or something, but just so that, you know, in this context, if you're not a philosopher, then I'm just very confused. So as a philosopher and a chemical ecologist, someone who has really brought some interesting concepts and ways of thinking, particularly with respect to how we can move towards situating humanity in relation to such things as artificial intelligence, but also technological society more broadly. There might be some points toward the future of how this conversation could develop, and perhaps that chemical ecology as well as process relational philosophy can be some frames that we can build out together and then use those to move into considering some of these questions that so many of us are really grappling with at the moment, civilizationally, and as well in terms of how we relate to that as subjects. So what is chemical ecology?
Yeah, so this is a question of branding, you know. So I was always, a toxinologist actually, or an evolutionary toxinologist, which is again a kind of slightly unique branding that I and maybe some others sort of came up with to differentiate ourselves from other toxinologists, like clinical toxinologists, for example. So toxinology with an N, not with a C, is specifically the study of organic toxins, so toxins made by organisms, right? Chemical ecology is the study of the ways in which organisms mediate relations with other organisms using chemical means, essentially by taking a chemical that they have produced themselves and exposing another organism to it. And in the sort of, limit case, that is, violently introducing it into the interior of another organism, as in venom, which is an injected poison. Venom is that class of poisons which is injected. So toxinology in some sense emerges as a subset of chemical ecology. And so whilst a lot of my work had been focused in toxinology and very specifically in the evolution of venom systems, particularly in reptiles, but also in things like spiders and colloids, so octopus, cuttlefish, squid, centipedes, scorpions, etc., vampire bats. The study of venom systems in reptiles, so everything from molecular evolution of genes that encode the toxins all the way through to the evolution of associated anatomy, so like venom glands, specialized tissues that produce the toxins, compressor musculature that squeezes those glands, if indeed that is present, the dentition, which comes in a wide variety of forms as well, and also then the ecology of venomous organisms. So what are snakes doing out and about in environments that is feeding back on the selection of those other aspects, right? So ecology is kind of the place where selection and evolution, where selection in evolution intersects, right? So chemical ecology is then the broader field in some sense, which is, because it's not just toxins, organisms are using pheromones, so-called effector molecules, which is a very sort of ambiguous class of molecules. It's very ubiquitous, in fact. Not only is venom itself, which seems highly specialized, incredibly common in nature. It's evolved independently over 100 times, and there are hundreds of thousands of venomous organisms, but the use of chemistry to mediate relations between organisms is basically ubiquitous.
Yeah. So if humanity is a technical species, And if we also think about our niche as the niche of niche construction, that what we are especially good at is influencing, well, I don't know if we're good at influencing each other exactly, but certainly we're effective at influencing environments which we then can further adapt to. In a sense, they're also adapting us. There's obviously this notion of ontological design, which is, what you create creates you in turn. If we are a technical species, then how can the domain of chemical ecology, bringing it back really to that level, although I don't know if level is the best way to think about it, bringing it back to that level or domain of analysis of evolutionary process, what are the kind of conceptual toolkits that we can bring to bear on understanding ourselves as a technical species?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so very good question. The way I've integrated chemical ecology, or a perspective coming from chemical ecology, with, broadly speaking, technicity, and we can get into all the techne words and disambiguate them, and really ultimately leading to a conception of life as technical. So all life is technical. I mean, humans are, of course, a technical species and often characterized as such, characterized as a tool-using species or as the tool-using species. But really, I'm saying life is technical in general. And so these things that you've already sort of prefigured, like niche construction and all of that, will come in as essentially generic processes for living systems. But chemical ecology specifically, of course I'm biased, it's home base, but does provide a bunch of very interesting partly because perhaps non-typical, although actually fairly typical as far as nature is concerned, but non-typical in terms of the way people generally think of, for example, tool use. So the existence of tools, and we also call tools technical objects. And so, for example, a typical toxin, again, let's say, is a trait of the organism that produces it. And so I want to make a key distinction between a trait and a technical object. Traits are not tools in the sense that you can think about a hand as a tool or whatever, but I want to disambiguate these things. A hand is a trait that we have. A technical object is slightly different. So again, I'll wind back. In chemical ecology, toxins often produced by the organisms that are using them, but not always. And in fact, quite commonly not. They are often also appropriated from other organisms. So there's a phenomenon, for example, called toxin sequestration, where one organism takes the toxins from another organism and then uses it for its own purposes. So I'm wearing this nudibranch shirt, and these nudibranchs, if people can see them, these three here are Chromodorus nudibranchs, and they're very brightly colored. That bright coloration is what we call aposematic coloration. That's warning coloration. That's basically saying, like, don't eat me, I'm poisonous. But these nudibranchs don't create the toxins themselves. They're not encoded by their own genomes that make them poisonous. In fact, they get them from their food. They eat sponges in this case. They take toxins from the sponges, which are there for the sponge's own defense, presumably. But unfortunately for the sponges, the nudibranchs are resistant to those toxins, and then they sequester them in their own tissues. And I have to do this as well. This is the so-called blue dragon, or the blue glaucus. This is another type of nudibranch, so it's another type of sea slug. And unlike these ones, which are benthic, which crawl around on the bottom, this is a pelagic sea slug. It's a pelagic nudibranch, right? So it swims around in the open ocean. And it specializes in feeding on Physalia, which is the Portuguese man of war or bluebottle. And what it does is something, it's just so cool, like I always have to bring it up, called kleptonidae. Klepto, theft, nidae, stinging cells. These guys are stealing the molecular toxins. This guy is stealing entire stinging cells, taking intact stinging cells from those blue bottles and storing them in its own tissue. So if you see one of these washed up on a beach, don't touch it, because it can sting you with stinging cells that it stole from another organism, basically, right? And this, again, turns out to be much more common than you think. It sounds really exotic, but the point here is that I am saying this is a form of tool use. So tool use is basically begins with, at least, finding something in your environment, a stick that's just lying around, a rock, whatever it is, and then taking that, and because of some, inherent properties that it has, but which are nothing to do with your, purposes, nothing to do with your desire to use it as a tool, but because a rock is hard or a stick is long and pointy or a toxin is toxic, taking it and using it for your own purposes. And this is what characterizes the kind of baseline tool use or the origin of a technical object. So it's taking it out of its context of genesis, like taking it out of the sponge's context in which the sponge's own genes are being expressed to produce these toxins, and taking it into another context and redeploying it for purposes which have nothing to do with its own genesis. Just as, a capuchin cracking nuts with a rock, or a crow using a stick to, prise beetle larvae out from under bark or something like that. Those purposes, that agency there, but those purposes, the use of those objects as tools has nothing to do with the geological genesis of the rock, or the functional genesis in the life of the tree that produced that stick. There's a functional reason from the tree's perspective why it has the properties that it has, but it's nothing to do with crows, getting beetle larvae out and getting a tasty snack. So that's what characterizes tool use at this kind of incipient level. And this is not the only kind of technicity there is. Technicity doesn't necessarily involve tool use, but this is, again, a kind of generic form of technical object that we find in nature.
Is it fair to say that technicity refers to the event of the era in which tools and techniques, or technical objects and traits, co-evolve and shape each other? Is it referring to fundamentally the interplay and the mediation of those dynamics? And that is the era of technicity.
Yes, or the domain even of technicity, to use a word you used earlier. Absolutely. So technicity is the consideration of, broadly speaking, techne, which includes technical objects and techniques and technology, which we'll get onto. The consideration of techne from the aspect of its genesis, right? That's what Simondon, Gilbert Simondon, who uses this term technicity, would say. So it is precisely from the the stance towards technicity, which is considering its role in, broadly speaking, the evolution of the life worlds.
Right, and that's why I use the language of era, just because, as far as I understand, in your thinking, you are designating the event of technicity as being, well, what would you say? That in some important sense, it is, would you say there is a before it, there is fundamental processes operating in the cosmos which are distinct from it, and then technicity comes about and is there and is like a critical chapter in the toolkit or dynamics that evolution as such then comes to work with. Do you think about evolution? How do you think about evolution as distinct from the dynamics at play in technicity? In what way can we say the cosmos, how can the cosmos be understood through evolutionary terms as distinct from the era of technicity?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question as well. I mean, so I do think there's an advent of technicity, which is essentially the advent of the origin of life, right? So I think life is technical. And you can think about that as the origin of agency as well. So there is what was, most conveniently described as physical evolution and chemical evolution, prebiotic evolution. There's an evolution of non-living systems. And perhaps we're going to need to get into, I mean, your question is leading us there, what definition of what evolution is, but there is an evolution of those things which are non-living, but that is non-technical evolution. So as far as I'm concerned, there's no technicity in, say, physical evolution. Now, technicity will, of course, exploit physical invariance, but there's a key term there, which is exploit, which designates the action, the activity of a certain agency. There are purposes. There's an intention to do one thing rather than another, to achieve some goal that emerges with life, but that I don't think is best thought of, although some people would take us in that direction, as operative in the domain that is, broadly speaking, the physical domain.
Okay. So if Charles Darwin was sitting here on the couch, how would he relate to how you're understanding evolution? In what way is this in line with, or, maybe challenging commonly the popular understanding of Charles Darwin? If we think of the popular understanding, we think of survival of the fittest. We almost bind evolution as such to living and dying processes.
Yeah. So the popular understanding of Darwin, I think, is quite different from Darwin's own conception. Survival of the fittest is a term from Herbert Spencer that Alfred Russel Wallace encouraged Darwin to adopt. Like, it's good branding. It makes a lot of sense. It's intuitive. And so that has come to stand in for evolution in general. But there's really a big story to talk about here. So evolution, in a sense, that the word evolution becomes synonymous with Darwin, but it's an ancient term. It goes back at least to Cicero in Evolutio, the Latin, and it just means unfolding. And it has, domain-specific meanings in both military contexts and in mathematics before it has a meaning in a biological context. And it was also kind of just in the air in the 19th century in particular. So kind of in the late 17th century, or mid to late 17th century through the 19th century, what we're having in science, we're having the emergence of a bunch of sciences and historical sciences, sciences in which the temporal dimension is explicitly operative or figured. So geology is a key one, and embryology is really the other major one. And then the term evolution comes into biology in the embryological context, and it's assigned to, or it's associated with, one of two primary positions amongst embryologists. Basically, the evolutionary position is in this case aligned with the preformationist position. So the embryo at its most early stages contains the adult form kind of in miniature, in a sense, right? So it's preformed and it just needs to unfold. Development is the process of the unfolding of a form that is present in that embryo from its conception, let's say. So it's the revealing of something. And this is basically a deterministic view, right? The other view is what was called epigenetics at the time. So it's kind of post, or in addition to the genesis of form that is prior to the embryo, right? It's something active happening in the developmental process, so that form is actually, developing in this manner imminent to the embryo as it actually differentiates. So initially evolution, it's in biology, it's this preformationist term. And then it immediately kind of, expands to the sociocultural stage, and it becomes associated with a notion of progress in particularly 19th century Europe. So the evolution of humanity, sort of what we would call cultural evolution, is the evolution of its cultural progress, basically. And actually Darwin quite famously avoids the word in the first edition of On the Origin of Species because he doesn't really want all those associations. So far from being the, originator or whatever of the term evolution, he's initially trying to avoid it because that notion is so pervasive, and he's saying, "No, I'm kind of doing something a little bit different here." But he later adopts that term as people say, "Look, you're talking about evolution. You might as well use the term." But what is really key to me about Darwin's intervention is not just that he's actually more on the epigenetic side of things. So it's a kind of anti-preformationist notion. So there is an imminent genesis of form. The way Darwin develops that idea is basically that he says forms, and in this case species, are secondary to variations, secondary to individuals. So we track these forms that we think of as species, and of course that's historically been associated with like special creation events of species essences, the essence of the horse, the essence of the dog, whatever, And in that context, which is not exactly Aristotelian, but basically scholastic, it's the way, Christian Europe inherited Aristotle. In that context, the deviations, or the reason every dog is not quite the same as every other dog, or every horse is not quite the same, so the deviations from the species essence, which is eternal and always the same, are accidental and basically noise. They're basically fuzz, But for Darwin, he is reversing that. He is saying, actually, if you look at nature, and I've looked at nature a lot, and Darwin is, obviously he's had the voyage of the Beagle and he's had certain epiphanies and things, but then he's asking basically every naturalist in his milieu to send him as much of their collection as they're willing to part with. And so he's got, thousands and thousands of beetles, he's studying domestic animals, he's studying orchids, he's doing all these different things. He's saying the more I look at things, the more it seems like every character is variable. So it doesn't seem as though we've really got a locked down form that there are sort of peripheral variations to. It really seems like variations are right at the center. And so then he ends up saying that species, which again is the analog of form and essence in this biological context, is a kind of arbitrary notion. Like it's the way we classify things. It's arbitrary in the sense that different systematists, different taxonomists will create different boundaries between species, so they'll assign forms differently. It's not arbitrary in the sense that it's not real. He is, in fact, accounting for the reality of clumps in distributions of variation through the process of natural selection. I don't know if that's taken us too far afield, but...
No, there's lots to work with there. Yeah, okay. So one of the things which this helps us to make clear is that we can participate in speciation. Now, a basic way to think about that is our relationship with dogs over time, and of course all the different things we eat and plants and what have you. But also in the context of humanity, we find ourselves involved in influencing our own change, which is a wild thing. One of the things which a thinker named Peter Kingsley, who's a scholar of Jung, and in a book called Catafalque, he makes the point that we should be wary of not only inflations of the anima or X and Y archetype, messianic inflation or what have you, but that we should be wary of the inflation of humanity as such, which is, well, by the light that we have been shedding here, we can say, well, be careful about eternalizing and essentializing in a fixed way what is, from that perspective, an arbitrary set of constraints, potentialities, ways of behaving. In so fixing them, we could say we are also fixing or foreclosing an evolving relationship and genuine creative relationship with such things as art, beauty, love even. And so from this perspective, we can say there is actually an ethical imperative to consider here. But at the same time, it's also quite a shocking notion to relate with, because if the concern is that we might become inflated with a particular image of what constitutes humanity, humanity understood as fixed image is already maybe playing around with the definition of the term, enforcing the definition of the term humanity to mean fixed image of what we might think about it, rather than that which participates in niche construction.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, something being fed into the premises here which is relevant. And if you were to turn around to me and say, well, humanity is, well, what we can say is that, and this is something we've spoken about a lot, and an argument you've made in a recent presentation in a conference that Matt Segal put on, who are pointing towards the predicament and the risks of influencing, designing, using the change potential inherent in, I suppose, the meaning of evolution and inherent to technicity, using that to cul-de-sac us, atrophy us. And I'm wanting to connect this to questions and dynamics in our time. Maybe they could be understood through certain developments, technological developments in the way of nuclear weapons or artificial intelligence, the way we mediate attention and use algorithms and mathematics and prediction in order to influence aggregate decision making and attempt to determine the behavior of populations. The way we can apply controlling strategic mindsets and toolkits to stultify, block, foreclose, diminish, addict, all these types of words come to mind. Our general capacity to connect, relate, participate in transformation. There's a phrase you have, the philosophical science of purposeful transformation, which could potentially be interesting to bring in here. If we're wanting to understand, clarify what it is to relate to our technical capacity, what it is to influence change, what it is to dignify the moment, the duration of humanity in the context of ecology, in the broader sense of belonging that we inhabit and participate in. We also want to understand how to purposefully mediate our environment. There's a lot in there. How would you articulate some of what I'm saying? Because I'm largely laying out some of the foundations of ideas that you've navigated before, and the tension I'm moving towards is wanting to furnish a conceptual landscape that can help us relate with the significance of our particular moment of technology, our particular moment of technicity, if we want to say that.
There is a lot there. So evolution is essentially generic and ongoing in this conception. And you brought up speciation, and really you referenced artificial selection. And of course, it is important that, Darwin begins on the origin of species with a discussion of artificial selection. So he defines selection in terms of intelligent design, right? So it begins there, and then he says, but there is this process of natural selection, which is a non-intelligent design, but it is analogical to that process of cultivation, which he mentioned. So like dogs, plants, etc., cultivars that we create. I just want to say, rather than saying speciation, even though you're not incorrect to say that, again, depending on how we define speciation, because it has domain-specific and more generic definitions. So in a domain-specific definition, people will say that all dogs are Canis familiaris, they're all the same species. That's kind of a moot point that doesn't really matter, but I would just nuance it to say we can participate in the genesis of forms, if you want, or in morphogenesis or something like that, right?
Can I give you the specific context in which I have in mind there? So intergenerational transmission of knowledge, but also the way that we cultivate our capacity for relating itself from the languages we use to how we navigate the landscape of intimacy. When we think of the idea of a cyborg, now in a sense, of course, we are already cyborgs, but if we take a particular style of transhumanism, which is wanting to kind of like evacuate the spirit from the body, right? Uploading consciousness as a bit of a meme, but that nevertheless, the various perceived deficiencies or lacks of the body will be left behind in favor of an idealized sense of whatever the aesthetic or goal is, however that's described. So we can imagine in the zeitgeist, there are these imaginings of how we can participate or cross a kind of threshold of something we value the participation in, and yet if we take a step back, colloquially, it could make a lot of sense to go, well, how is this the same species? And I know you're saying participate in the genesis of forms, but can it be as radical as that though? You know?
Yeah, I just steer us away a little bit from the species concept and the species problem, just because it's just a bit of a thicket of debate in biological context, and it kind of doesn't matter. But species in the generic sense, which really is just to say different forms or something like that, no need for reproductive isolation or certain thresholds of, genetic intermixing or whatever, bracketing all of that, then yes, we can be talking about the genesis of novel species. Again, like evolution, species is a term that appears in lots of different contexts, and biology doesn't have the last word on that. So I think, you're appropriate in that. Transhumanism, I think, would be the quintessential example of the kind of inflation that you were talking about when you referenced Peter Kingsley and Catafalque, and that is my favourite secondary book on Jung. As you might know, it's a great book.
It's a great book.
Yeah. I don't want to cede to transhumanism the notion of transformation, the notion of transdisciplinarity. So I think about, say, like the humanities as a kind of, discipline or a suite of techniques, which includes pedagogy, which you've sort of implicitly referenced in terms of how we're transmitting to the next generation, so a mode of inheritance. I want to think about the possibility of a humanities that can be properly transdisciplinary, that isn't trying to model itself on, a notion of specialization that comes from the special sciences, for example. It can be transdisciplinary, so it can be transformative, so it can have a kind of, stewardship type of role. And it can be technical, because that in fact is what we mean by technique. And the technical here is, again, we mean a certain kind of intervention in dynamical processes that directs them in one direction rather than another. So, life is technical in the sense that, living systems, and there are technical ways of talking about this in terms of sparse coupling and sequestrations of degrees of freedom and, the complex structure of organisms and blah, blah, blah. But they are not simply driven by, say, like efficient cause from behind, right? They're not physically determined in that sense. I mean, some people would say they are. I'm saying they're not. They have their own ends. And that is the essence of technique. Right. So it is what my friend Jason Tuckwell would call a deviation. It's the capacity to intervene in and deviate those basically, inertial flows that are always sort of pushing and constraining, and deviate for some basically purposeful agential reason. And so a kind of a transdisciplinary and philosophical science, and by philosophical science, I mean a science that is willing to critique its own presuppositions. A philosophical science of purpose is a science that is attendant to these issues. And then in critiquing its presuppositions, it is critiquing those models that tend to come from physical theory, so-called effective theories, which are associated with the development of technology and also with predictive knowledge in physical domains and things like that, and are incredibly powerful and effective in those domains to which they are appropriate. But it is a matter then of critiquing the presuppositions of such models and asking, well, is in fact the whole world like this? Are these models adequate to describe, say, living systems? And, TLDR, no, they're not, but we only get there through a rigorous technical and genealogical critique of those models themselves. And so this comes to one of the I think big points that you were gesturing towards, is avoiding taking something that is the achievement of some, broadly speaking, genetic process, ontogenetic process or morphogenetic process, the genesis of being or of a form or of a particular organization or order or structure or whatever, avoiding taking something that is the product of genesis as fundamental, as eternal, as timeless, and thus as invariant, invariable. Like saying, no, these things are in fact specific achievements. Even physical invariants themselves, and this gets back to a sort of generalized notion of evolution, these are achievements of genetic processes, and at certain levels, maybe not with certain physical invariants, obviously, but we have the capacity to intervene and to transform, to change these things. So by saying like they're not sort of sacred cows, by pushing back on a certain conservative impulse, which is to say, either to say this is the way it is, essentially, and it has always been this way, and these are universals, or to say like we've achieved this, knowledge with a capital K, we've achieved a certain point, and now we don't want to deviate from that. To say, no, like in a sense, everything's up for grabs, but not in a kind of, chaotic, willy-nilly manner, in a technical manner, where we're understanding how the things that we have were achieved. So we are seeing that they're not undeconstructible because we are charting their construction, and then understanding the degrees of freedom that we have from that kind of position. And so that enables, so the idea goes, a real understanding of what constraints we're subject to in any domain, because it's basically a kind of diagram of constraint and enablement, which is analogically generic, so generic across all of these domains, and takes a lot from physical theory in that sense. It just doesn't take those fundamental constraints as invariable across all domains, but saying, okay, if we come to understand the nature of constraint and enablement, and those are two sides of the same coin, then maybe we can understand how we can deviate things. And that would be becoming more explicitly, more consciously, a or the, if you want, technical species, the quintessentially technical species that we imagine ourselves to be. This is already part of our self-image, but we want to avoid inflation because we're saying, well, life does this in general, but we can do it in a particular way. Just as when I was in the chemical ecological domain and I was talking about, slugs finding molecular tools in their environment. Well, that's what human pharmacology is predicated on. Human pharmacology is predicated on people living in specific ecosystems, finding plants that have properties that are of use to them, etc., and blah, blah, blah. So we turn it into a science, and that is a process of turning evolution into intelligent design, in a sense, right? When we create drug libraries where we're varying molecules by small amounts and seeing whether this gives an effect that is more like the one we want or minimizes toxicity or whatever it might be, we're intervening in that process, but intervening in it by understanding at the same time how generic it really is. And that hopefully leads to a kind of avoidance of inflation and this weird dynamic we have where on the one hand we're like, humans are so powerful and we can change anything. And then also the disavowal of the responsibility that we have and this sort of deterministic mechanistic view of things becomes a way of disavowing that responsibility because it's a way of saying, well, things are just the way they are and we can't really make a difference, or, we are subject to these determining causes coming from behind, etc., etc. So it's trying to sit in an uncomfortable middle zone there where we're not inflationary, but at the same time we're not too deflationary. We are saying, like, we have power here, capacity.
Yeah, right. It's interesting how this particular pattern of affirming the particular value, as far as we can discern it, of our present form and capacity, and at the same time affirming the need to adapt and change, as well as perhaps the drive, which could be characterized by a certain disposition toward creativity or a relation as creativity, that there's this question of the future and our adaptation to it, which dislodges this image of the satisfactory form that we currently have. You can see these dynamics play out in politics and in general, mediating the relation between these two, what we should keep the same and what we should change, and how we can come to, in a sense, kind of like fetishize an image of the future, and also fetishize a moment of our history. You can think of a certain fascist tendency towards that, perhaps, and as well, perhaps in the future projecting historical materialist analysis, which is built into it an orientation toward the future of, well, there is an idealized state, or at least more idealized state, that we can move towards, and however many eggs that it takes to break in order to make this particular omelette, well, it's okay. So yeah, it is interesting how so much comes back to what it is to mediate. So in the project, for those who have been listening for some time, will consistently refer to sort of the context of cultural shamanism, and shamanism can be understood from many different angles. Of course, healing and art, perhaps a whole range of different things. Without going too far into it, part of the question and challenge that invites us to consider is how we mediate not only the relationship between sort of self and other, but also how we mediate the dynamics of the membrane. What constitutes the transmembranic process of relating with potential, with others, with institutional authorities, and of course the people that populate them, the subjects that populate them. I'm really interested in what it means to cultivate trust when we can rely neither on the past as containing all of our answers, nor can we rely on the promise of some future realization which claims to have all the answers. In that sense, there is a mess and a difficult middle ground to participate in. And it does seem like the thought and activity which I find to be most generative is consistently relating to tensions and questions of this type. So I could say more there, but I'll just maybe just leave that as a comment and see what that sort of draws from you.
Yeah, well, a number of things. So this mediation, and you said the nature of the membrane. I think there are different kinds of relations that one has with things that might be seen as a form of constraint or enablement again, and that can be everything from interpersonal relationships through to relationships with collectives that vastly exceed oneself. And I think there's a fundamental difference between being in a relationship that's mutually transformative, that's reciprocal basically, and a relationship that's one directional, where you're in relationship with something that isn't in relationship with you, right? And so, the latter dynamic describes the kind of inculturation or interpolation of the individual into the pre-existing, cultural form that basically says, this is what you eat, this is how you dress, this is what you do, blah, 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 And then the other dynamic is what Simondon would call the trans-individual, which is where that collective level doesn't pre-exist in a formed sense, in a structured sense, the entering interrelationship of the individuals that sort of constitute it, so that it is itself has an open horizon of transformation in that relationship between the many individuals that comprise it. And so again, that's a notion where you're taking you're positing, or you have a direct experience of it, I would say, a capacity for, ongoing transformation that is kind of imminent to you as a living embodied agent. And you are making that available in relationship with something that's other, with some alterity. But that's a kind of vulnerability, obviously, because you could make that available, and then again, that system or that person or whatever doesn't reciprocate, doesn't make their own capacity for transformation available to you, and you can get wounded in that process. I mean, you can get wounded regardless, right? But this resonates a lot with what you're talking about in terms of shamanism. And again, yes, as you suggested, that can mean a lot of different things, and it has a specific origin, and there are anthropologists who don't like that term as a general term and whatever. But if we are using it in a generic term, it does seem to characterize a set of practices, let's say, rituals, etc., that are involved with an encounter with something that's radically radically other, And of course, in many contexts, that might be restricted to a very specific class of the society, and that can become an authoritarian thing in and of itself. Only we have the access to that source of truth, and we are going to give it to you, and we're imposing it on you. And, I know that's not what you're talking about. We're talking about, a situation in which, in some sense, not to trivialize or make it ridiculous, but everyone can be, shamanic in that way, right? Everyone has that capacity to get in touch with something that is other, in the sense that it is not prefigured or preformed or contained in say, your priors, in your, the structure that you're bringing to the encounter. It is excessive in relationship to that. So it's what Jung would call numinous, right? It's autonomous. And the basic idea that I think comes under the rubric of this shamanism is that in an encounter with that excess, or that alterity, or however you want to frame it, is intrinsically transformative, because it is a calling in, like the making available of that opening of oneself up, such that sort of, dynamic, transformative, unpreformed, unprecanalized, unprethinked capacity that you have as a living organism, the making available of that, which is what is requisite for having that encounter in the first place. Because again, you're not pre-subjugating, you are allowing the numinous to be numinous, to be its autonomy, and just that contact with it is going to, you're surrendering your autonomy to perceive the autonomy of the other. You are, in a sense, becoming more heteronymous in order to be open to, available to the autonomy of the other, whatever it might be. Again, that's potentially dangerous. This is how, Jung would write about psychotherapy, though, So, prefiguring those sort of anti-psychiatric movements, which were very concerned about the authoritarian position of the psychiatrist or the psychotherapist, which is, in a lot of ways how things have gone. And that's very close to chemical ecology in my wheelhouse, and that's something we can definitely talk about. Although I'd be careful what I say in that context a little bit. But, there are very valid anti-psychiatric critiques to be made. But if you read Jung on psychotherapy, he's talking about getting to a place, through a great deal of learning, through a great deal of comparative study of different human cultures and different modes of rituals for, practices for, etc., encounters with the numinous, which might be the unconscious. There's a numinous within as well as the numinous without. There's the other within. He is talking about how, you're developing a framework, you're studying, you're learning to the nth degree. There's a great responsibility to be learned, he thought, to differentiate your own psyche so that it can encompass a lot of the range of variation present in humanity. But then in the encounter with the other, the idea for Jung is to suspend all of that in the sense that you're not pre-selecting some subset of that to impose onto the other for them to be categorized in your preformed scheme. The scheme is only there to differentiate your thought such that any part of it can be spontaneously elicited by the other and indeed transformed in that encounter, that elicitation. And, I always, again, I'm this analogical thinker, and I'm like, how does this connect to evolution? How does this connect to chemical ecology? And I'm like, this is just what happens in chemical ecology and what happens in evolution. All evolution is co-evolution. Just as all individuation is relational, no one individuates on their own. It's inherently trans-individual in that sense. No organism evolves in a vacuum, you evolve in an ecosystem. And what you are, what an organism is, its form, is an imminent achievement and an ongoing. Although there are temporal scales here, some things are very stable over very long periods of time, but some things are changing moment to moment. And you can think about, notions of plasticity in that context. But it's an imminent achievement that is relational, that is fundamentally ecological. That's why I say ecology is selection in what I think of as the fundamental evolutionary triad, which is variation, selection, and inheritance. Ecology is sitting at that selection point of view. Its relations with other organisms, including of one's own species, and in particular of one's own species in social species, that are making us what we are.
Yeah, well said. So, yeah, there's so many vital threads here and definitely can't take them all on. One of the differentiations I make in the context of transformative process with other people, and that aspect of shamanism, let's say, is along the lines of the difference between holding space and sharing space. But also, the thing is that there is a dipping in and out of these modes. Sometimes you need the picture to hold steady.
Yeah.
What are the roles and associated responsibilities which we actually want to be clear on as a point of trust as we step into a process together, and then what might open up for mutual transformation in the context of sharing space. One of the things that seems of deep ethical importance is to not bar the way for others to share space, right, fundamentally. But that doesn't mean that it's, whatever time you like, happy hour's always on. Not at all. And it's not as though there isn't a role for holding space. When we think in some of the ways we are here, and we think in triadically or relationally, there are different angles of conceptual approach to elements of a process which is to an important degree in continuity with itself. And yet we are seeking to be in relationship with the radicality of change, the radicality of evolution, and so also discontinuity. And here's where, vulnerability comes back in again, but also the wonder and the value of to be found in risking for what's on the other side of, well, I'm sitting here happy, vibing along to this particular rhythm of a jam or some music, but I just get a sense something I'm tuning into is letting me know that there might be, there was somewhere to go that increased the complexity, increased the beauty of the experience. And of course, that could fall flat or not. And so this discernment capacity we have, what it is to orient in relationship with thresholds, is a lot of what seems to be important to speak about in the context of what it means to participate in transformation. So a lot of different directions there.
Yeah, I of course like that you brought in the musical example there to illustrate both the importance of constraint. Constraint isn't just constraint per se, isn't just shutting things down. In the evolutionary context, when I speak about selection is constraint, right? Selection is saying there is a field of variation here, and some subset of that is being selected and amplified through its propagation to, the next generation, if you want, but the next iteration or whatever, if you're thinking in sort of quasi-algorithmic terms. But that's what is going to, have don't really love the term, but sort of over-determining or represented influence on the trajectory of the system, of the next state of the system. So constraint is pervasive, but it also has this enabling aspect to it. And in a musical context, right? I mean, there's a place for free improvisation and free jazz. But even there, you've set that up ahead of time. You've said with whoever you're playing with or whatever, or maybe not if you're doing it on your own, and maybe you're surprising your audience because you normally play three chords and the truth, and now you're launching into some wild, Ornette Coleman imitation. But generally speaking, there's already the setup of an expectation. We're going to have this free improvisatory section here or in the piece, and it'll go for this long or whatever, or I'll signal you, I'll cue you, and we're going to move to the next section of the piece. But in most improvisatory contexts in music, there are pretty strong constraints, like in a sort of classical, like classic jazz context, you have the song form itself, right? You'll have a certain chord progression, you'll have certain melody that is characteristic of that song that you might reference as a theme in your improvisation, and then you might have a certain number of bars, a certain number of choruses, a run through of the whole chord progression or a subset of the chord progression, which acts as a kind of constraint, obviously, on where you're likely to go, but also an enablement. And of course, like a particularly virtuosic improviser can take that to places that nobody would expect. But nonetheless, it's that improvisation, in order for it to make sense in that musical context, is going to make reference to the theme. It's going to be variations on the theme. It's going to make reference to the implicit theme, which is in the chord progression, so you're going to resolve at certain points, even if you're delaying resolution or playing with expectations and things like that. So there's a very intimate and intricate interplay between constraint and improvisation in those sorts of contexts. But then risk becomes a really important consideration there as well, right? If you don't want to just play something that's really generic and basically is genuinely improvisatory. It's not that you've learned a bunch of licks that work over that chord progression, or that you're just going to recite the melody over and over again, or just play the chord tones or whatever. I mean, these things will make sense for people with some musical knowledge. But if you're going to try and create on the bandstand, do something novel, then you are taking a risk. There's always the chance that you're going to fall flat on your face, play something that doesn't work. Of course, again, if you're a very skilled improviser, as like Thelonious Monk would say, there are no wrong notes, only wrong resolutions. You can correct a mistake. You can engineer the context for a note on the fly if you've got those degrees of freedom. But again, you've only been afforded those degrees of freedom because of the amount of practice that you've done and because of the degree of familiarity you have with that particular kind of context, which is everything from, again, the constraints of the particular song that you're playing, the particular tempo you're playing it at, the feel you're playing it at, the musicians you're playing with, because everybody feels things a little bit differently, and you've got to trans-individually achieve a certain collective feel. It's really difficult, if you start playing with a new drummer for the first time and you're like, oh, like I often bring material to a session myself, and I feel my own riffs differently from the way like a drummer and even people that I play with a lot feel them, and so the thing will almost immediately, as soon as we start playing together, something trans-individual will occur, even if that's just like shifting the feel very, very slightly. And you've got to be comfortable with the discomfort that moving out of that initial comfort zone of, no, this riff sits here for me, unless you're like, hardcore band leader and you're like, no, you play it like this. But for that collective thing to happen, which is not authoritarian, where you're not simply forming the other in your image, you've got to be willing to be a little bit uncomfortable. And that's so key for, I think, a lot of the things that we're talking about. And really this, philosophical science of purposeful transformation and all of that. I mean, part of that, we talked about an encounter with the numinous, with the autonomous. That's an encounter with a limit, right? That's an encounter with like the limit of your knowledge. It is not something that is pre-statable, prefigured, pre-canalized, already subjugated or whatever. And you can, of course, react to that with a violent reaction where you exert more force to try and subjugate it, to try and impose your will on it, to bring it into conformity with what you did expect or what you had already preformed with your, broadly speaking, comfort zone. Or again, you can enter into that reciprocal mutual transformation, which is the genuine encounter with the limit. And so maybe this is too long a bow to draw, but when I said that the philosophical science is the science that critiques its presuppositions, I am talking about saying like, well, what do the actual postulates, the axiomatic postulates of the formalisms that we're really used to using in, broadly speaking, physical as science, what are they in some sense covering over? They afford, as a set of constraints, they afford us a certain kind of grip, but where they fail to give us, say, the predictive knowledge or the kind of control that they do give us in certain contexts, and hence their great power, where they fail to do that, what are they covering over? And do we have the kind of courage to say, well, look, there's something going on here that, is not accounted for by the model that I'm very familiar. It was really hard to learn this stuff in postgrad. I've put all this effort into learning a bunch of formal techniques. Am I willing to go like, well, they're limited, they can't account for a certain aspect of ongoing transformation that seems very evident in biological systems. And am I willing to kind of like pull under the hood and maybe deconstruct those formalisms and see, where did they come from? What is their genesis?
Yeah. One image that's come into mind there is, I think of institution, one might think of it's like something that moves towards the cleanly. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like almost surgical. Everything's got its place. This is how it all functions for efficiency. But that knowledge and insight and understanding these things as well, they come through the cracks. It's mess, it's outside the building. It's radical. Yeah. So, and of course, is also the kind of thing that can be gleaned as a consequence or aided along by the consistency and strength of formalisms that make certain inquiry possible. Absolutely. As well. Obviously, it goes without saying.
And it's what the institution was, if we're talking about academia and we're going back to Plato and whatever, it's what it was set up to facilitate. It's what monasteries are set up to facilitate. And, people can live the life of the mind in this cloistered environment. They can become vulnerable, but this all too readily becomes, a subjugating imposition of absolute constraint.
Yes. All right. I think we're far enough along into this now for me to begin to draw some things together, and we'll see where we can go. So for those of you listening, don't expect something necessarily straightforward to come through this. So some of the dynamics here, which I really want to involve in the space, I mentioned the word cleanly before. I think the relationship between purity and impurity is really important. Can approach that from a number of different angles. Also speaks to the kind of, at a psychological level, discussed sensibility, which is tremendously relevant to questions of violence. And when we speak about subjugation at that level, I think these angles in are helpful. One thing which is a continued question for me, and we get at it when we relate with the challenge of mediation. You have a phrase here, the context-specific constraint construction as a hallmark of vital systems. You've sort of spoken to that really over the last 20 to 30 minutes. We've spoken to the risks associated. I like to think about, risk as being necessary for art to emerge, But in play here is the really the massive challenge of the relationship between the interior and the exterior. Now, from other levels of description, we could approach this potentially from a mind and matter perspective. This particular dynamic is traced through in all manner of what have been for people frustrating dualisms that can be too hastily reduced one way or another. It is, of course, hilarious that here we are relating with them no problems at all in some sense. And now what do we mean by that? Of course, then opens up the question of the intellectual project of stipulating exactly what we mean by that. But in mediating the relation between the interior and the exterior, some of the language introduced at the beginning, this language of technicity, tools, and traits. Of course, it's curious because I can consider my hand or foot a trait, and certainly the techniques that I develop to use them in various ways give me certain affordances. Of course, there are various constraints associated with just the biomechanics of those features. But from the perspective of how I function in a football team, one can think about the tools that I have to offer. Now, then we can think, okay, well, what I can do with the technical process of kicking a football in the air enables me to cross the ball, which means someone else can head the ball. But if no one can kick the ball in the air, you can't head the ball. So you might say this relationship between tools and traits as we consider the trans individual, when we consider different zones of collectivity, different parasitic or symbiotic relationships. And then as we factor in the dimension of potentiality, and so in that sense, however we want to characterize that, or the virtual perhaps, however we want to characterize that, we're introducing the potential forms or models or intuitions of potential relationships, or the kinds of context-specific constraints we might desire to construct together. We're navigating these tensions between, who am I in relationship to that? Just what does this constraint actually afford for individuals and groups? The reason why I'm bringing this in is because when we think about how we can be influenced, how we are being influenced by our moment of technology, algorithms, artificial intelligence, capitalism, market economies. And then you could also look then how algorithms and various things can be applied in service of state ideology, right? So it's not just about untethered market dynamics are bad, without also being aware that the same kind of attitude taken towards the reduction of life to quantitative strategic modeling to serve some fixed prior image of value then enforced on others, that can be employed whether in a more centralized way or in a sense can manifest in a more diffuse or decentralized way. But from the perspective of thinking about the kind of movements through history, people use language like egregores, even spirits, entities, different ways of analogizing or characterizing more or less stable patterns over some duration, which influence the subjects or constituent elements of them to some degree. I might as well be just as much a trait of capitalism as I might consider my hand to be a trait of what I can bring to bear as a well-mediated technical maneuver with the technical object of a football on a pitch. We belong in these nested but also entangled relations. And coming to awareness of what we are being moved by and what is influencing us on the world historical stage, as well as, of course, more imminently in a psychological sense. And of course, in mentioning the unconscious, we can do this same process and look inwards rather than outwards, perhaps, as well, in terms of thinking about how archetypal functionality or dynamics, however we want to ontologize them metaphysically, however, whatever we have to say about that, we can still point to patterns, parts, interrelated patterns within us that may function to some degree like organs of the psyche, which have their own sort of processes which maneuver us or seek to realize themselves energetically in various ways. Of course, in mediation with the external and how we might light up the world through those lenses, those organs of perception even, right? So there's this key in all of this that I'm wanting to draw on is back to what it means to participate in transformation, what it means to participate in mediation. And I'm wanting to bring in the complexity of how we in this context of civilization. Cadell Last speaks about this quite a lot. He's been on the podcast a number of times. He speaks about the global brain singularity, and there's lots of ways of sort of speaking about how the complexity of the entangled digital network relations that have come about as a result of our technical capacities, have radically changed the constraints that we participate in or are maneuvered by. Can we think about those from a certain kind of autonomous perspective in that sense, in the same way, ants being a kind of hive species that there's an aspect to us which can also function this way. And that is, they're really radical thoughts to bring, and a radical kind of awareness to bring into presence when we consider what it is to really share space together and think about the future. And the purity and impurity thing there is kind of interesting. I mean, there would need to be a few other links made, but certainly at a too basic level, to speak to the ways that different people might have their immune systems start to function. That doesn't whether it doesn't seem safe to speak about, or that's nonsensical, or maybe that in opening up or seeding or seeking to transmit some understanding, or really to presence the criticality of a question, can be felt to be tremendously destabilizing, of course, to bring in the piece about the potential lacks in institutional status quo, because of course what we're basically taking as critical here is that just status quo process is it's just a tremendous reduction on what the dynamics of reality in participation with itself actually is. So yeah, really just wanting to bring into the space the challenge of recognizing ourselves as nested and embedded and entangled at multiple levels. And I'm curious if you could weave back in some of this language that might be specific to chemical ecology, or thinking about evolution from a transdisciplinary perspective, that can shed some light on how we can navigate, again, our particular technological moment with respect to what we have constructed, which has these feedback and feed forward effects on us.
Yeah, there's an awful lot there. So I was tempted at the beginning, by the discussion of mind and matter and interior and exterior and all of that. But we'll bracket those for a moment and maybe come to that, maybe interior and exterior at least. But so I think we're circling this issue of technique and techne in general, and so kind of asking in a sense how we become technicians, so how we develop the techniques that we need to navigate these multi-level constraints, systems of constraints that we find ourselves embedded within. How do we become maybe also technologists, and not ceding that to the technocrats or those who are often thought of as technologists? And so Simondon again is keen to make this distinction here that when we speak about technology, we're not just speaking about technical objects. That we tend to conflate those things. We tend to say that this iPhone or whatever is a piece of technology, whereas Simondon is keen to emphasize the logos, the ology aspect of that word, and say, no, this is really the study of technical objects in a particular sense. So how do we become technicians? How do we become technologists so that we can skillfully intervene? And one of the ways that I would, because there's a lot that you're saying there, and there's a lot of complexity, and one of the ways that I would, as you've suggested, but that's just because you know me well enough to know this is what I would do, I would try and begin with a kind of basic diagram again, and some sort of fundamental principles or whatever. And so I would say, like, part of what we're talking about is the relationship between niche construction and inheritance. So the question is, how are certain patterns of constraint stabilized over different timescales? So whether those are, cosmic timescales, evolutionary timescale, like geological timescales, biological evolutionary timescales, developmental timescales, or which would include things like learning and plasticity, and of course somewhere in there is like cultural evolution, and so part of it is a question of like, how did things get to be the way they are? So there's a genealogical study here. There's like a study of history, essentially, like how did things get to be the way they are? But again, it's a deep history. It's trying to understand how similar processes are going on at all of these different timescales to see if there is some kind of basic dynamic that we could extract that would enable us to become those technicians, that would enable us to be more skillful in our interventions with these, incredibly complex, if we're thinking just at the level of particularity, nested constraint structures or whatever. So, I mean, inheritance in general is about, how do we store a pattern so that in an ongoing manner it will constrain our, let's say, behavior, broadly speaking. one of the other things that you brought up there is thinking about, again, this is this sort of fractal notion of like, yes, we have molecules inside us and like the structures of our cells are constraining distributions of molecules and blah, 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 blah. But we are also potentially the molecular level of some molar structure which exceeds us, right? And so Raymond Rouillère introduces this distinction between the molecular and the molar, which people like Deleuze and Guattari pick up and make a lot of use of, which is, again, just, that at any given level of analysis, there is the particular primary variables in some sense, which are being canalized, which are the molecules, by some molar form, which is that constraint or canalizing function. And this is, very much de rigueur for kind of contemporary complex system science indeed. And even things like the free energy principle, synergetics, which to some extent the free energy principle comes out of, is the development of these equations which basically have these nested functions within them. So there's like the solenoidal function, which is essentially just repeating the same thing, the non-compressible function, and then there's a noise function, which is like dancing inside that to some extent. It's moving at a faster time scale. So it's a separation of time scales. This one level is changing very slowly. This one level is changing very quickly. And the quick things are, in a sense, constrained by the slow things. But the important nuance then, which is more difficult to figure formally, is that Darwinian nuance, which is that, but the slowly changing things actually have their genesis in the faster changing things, and there is an ongoing, transformation there. So there's a top-down, we might say. Not a fan particularly of that way of thinking, but it's evocative at least. There's a top-down constraint, but at the same time, something is bubbling up and modifying those constraints in an ongoing manner. But so, inheritance is about stabilizing these constraining influences over time. DNA is much like that. DNA is like a sedimented set of, basically protein forms that worked. They were selected for in some previous, generation, in some previous environment. And DNA almost literally works as a constraint on ribosomes, like saying, look, ribosome, you could produce all kinds of proteins, but these are the ones that work. These are the ones we're inheriting, right? But of course, inheritance is very multimodal in biological systems. And one of the aspects of inheritance that is very relevant here is niche construction. And so niche construction is basically a way of externalizing those constraints into the environment so that a certain, viable window of environmental states is recapitulated. We're in a house, it's like cold and windy and like gross Melbourne weather outside. Why do I live in? No, I won't complain about it. But I'm a child of the tropics, and I miss the tropics sometimes on days like this. But we're inside, and I actually even ran just before you got over here, the central heating a little bit, but we are sheltered from that. So we have set up a bunch of constraints, basically, which are creating an interior and an exterior, conveniently enough for segueing into that, but I'll let you respond first. But, we're keeping that nasty Melbourne weather on the outside, and in here we're still wearing jumpers and long pants, but which are more constraints, keeping that body heat close to us and all of that. But we are constraining our environment in order to make it, more habitable to us. But that's a mode of inheritance as well. And not just in the sort of, facile sense in which, you might inherit your parents' house when they die or whatever, but that from moment to moment, we're keeping the environment more constant because we've set up a bunch of constraint functions. And then so the big question, and I'm only just setting the ground for even talking about those kinds of questions, is about how all of these multimodal inheritance, the way we externalize and internalize constraint functions, which mean that we can recapitulate dynamics over time, how they kind of accrete into these really complex structures which constrain us on all of these different levels. Again, from the interpersonal, there's like a set of norms that and not least the language that we're using, which constrain this kind of interaction. The language I'm using is constraining your spontaneous brain activity right now to the extent that you're paying attention, and then there are all of these other things that we're talking about, that again, constraint and enablement. And there is a way to talk about this, but I won't develop it now because I've talked for a while, but in terms of chemical ecology specifically, and a notion that I have there of the relationship between what I call disruptive pharmacology and normative pharmacology. And so this is basically about, and again, figured in like empirical detail, but the way an exogenous chemical comes from some alterity, some exteriority, enters into a system, and because it is not part of that system's own genetic pathway, disrupts something in it. And this is like a basic mechanism for toxicity, not only toxicity, but toxicity. But then this can actually transition in a way when organisms enter into closer and closer relationships, and things like, I mentioned these, nudibranchs, for example, things like toxin resistance develop and things like that. And say a parasitic or an antagonistic relationship can actually evolve into a commensal, like a neutral relationship, or indeed a mutualist relationship where one organism is now dependent on the exogenous chemistry of another organism in order to achieve its own target states developmentally. And that kind of sounds exotic maybe when you say it like that. It's not only like completely ubiquitous almost with marine invertebrates, for example, that they go from pelagic larval stages to benthic and sessile adult stages, and in order to undergo metamorphosis they need certain bacterial metabolites, blah blah blah. But it's the concept of the holobiont in general, which we're now much more familiar with, the microbiome. Like you can't digest your food or even produce enough neurotransmitters or whatever without metabolites that you get from microorganisms that are not the product of your own genome. They're not the products of your own lineage if we're speaking about the genomic lineage, but they are nonetheless inherited, and they are, again, multimodally inherited from your mother, but also inherited from the environment, and which is kept stable in a niche construction manner, blah, blah, blah. But you are obliged to have them in you essentially to function, not as profoundly as like an organism which can't undergo metamorphosis and achieve its adult state without a bacterial metabolite or whatever it might be. And of course, it often goes the other way, like many parasites can't live without their hosts and blah, blah, blah. But this kind of relation of, what I call, it's basically where ecology, this is cribbing from another author, but where ecology becomes physiology. I think about this in terms of this disruptive to normative transition. And we need both. We need norms, but we need to be able to disrupt them in some ways as well, right?
Yeah. Well, that right there, again, brings us to the central tension, one of, if not the central tension of this dialogue, as well as many others I've been having, also lots of the work. I mean, this is the fundamental existential question for society. What norms must be upheld, and where is transgression necessary? Mm-hmm. I've looked up here, and I've looked up the top of your bookcase, and the first thing I saw was the matter with things. The matter with things, not necessarily to involve McGilchrist immediately here, but the matter with things.
I haven't read it, so don't.
The matter with things is that we may not have awareness. We certainly do not have the awareness of all the ways that norms are already conditioning us, giving the example of the microbiome. But also at the all too human level of subterfuge, of unconscious process. And yeah, it's so interesting. There's so much. This really is unfolding in, again, 6 to 8 hour dialogue, and I would love to just invite particular people in to bring their piece, to bring things to a place of, hopefully continuity with the many conversations people may have been listening to here. And part of what's been woven into our dialogues is the importance of communication, the various ways that conversational, but communicational process more broadly can enable the coming to awareness and presencing of what may at first appear as subtleties, but which, on peeling back the layers or approaching tip of the iceberg and then peering underneath the water, all of a sudden reveal tremendously powerful constraints that, if we don't presence them, render so much more of the content of the conversation potentially far less relevant than we thought. So one of the things which comes up for me tremendously as I approach different contexts that are seeking to bring depth and complexity to their discourse would, for instance, be finance, capital, and the various forms of power associated with that. But then we can also look at the different forms of power associated with attention in the context of the digital world, and more broadly at a level of, status and hierarchy in society generally. There's so much that is not only uncomfortable, it's uncomfortable, can be uncomfortable, but partly why it can be uncomfortable, I guess, to work with that metaphor physically, is that it turns out that maybe the elevation of my chair is, and the authority associated, is in part due to factors which haven't actually been present in the conversation, which are absolutely conditioning and constraining how others can even address me. You mentioned the example of, well, if we can't digest our food without this symbiotic relationship, but also a certain kind of, there is an interdependence, but that interdependence can become a dependence. And take addiction as an example. We can engage in patterns of behavior which can shorten our life expectancy and bring an awful amount of pain and suffering, and at the same time need them in the short term to survive. What is it to detoxify oneself, or come off and survive the withdrawal symptoms from various things? How difficult it is to open up degrees of freedom for considerations of real patterns in our time when we are subjugated by economic dynamics which require us to hook ourselves up almost matrix-like. And that effectively is the analogy here, that there's a kind of almost like a self-inflicted jacking into the matrix in order to receive the fuel to even keep going in an effort to open up degrees of freedom, if we can be nuanced enough and clever enough to open up different network potentials. There's so much that it seems like to contend with, where we as sort of mesoscopic creatures in the middle of things relative to the macroscopic patterns and microscopic patterns, whether of economics and system at that level, or the movements of geology or geopolitics, as well as at the all too human level of psychology and psychoanalysis and survival needs at a more proximal level, toxinology, chemical ecology. There's part of how it seems to me that we can actually cultivate, what is it to safeguard, what is it, but also what is it to strengthen? Again, safeguard almost like, well, we've kind of got it already, we just need to safeguard it. There's an active process of sort of strengthening, right? Is maybe a better way to look at it in terms of how I think about, integrity. Integrity is a sort of a sharing of space, but strengthening of capacity to hold together in that moment of the process, but then also let go and stretch out and whatever else, and to be strong enough to do that. That's one of the cameras, but we've still got audio and we'll have one of them on. In drawing my own expression to a close here, I think we can cultivate a strength and also a sensitivity to the dimensionality and the tension, the depth as well as the breadth of being with the process of understanding, what kind of constraints can really support that process? What does it mean to support that? There's something in there without which I don't think we can meaningfully progress in a manner that is vital without taking what it means to, in an embodied sense, navigate the complexities of communication as such, because of all these constraints, visible and invisible. It's the different dimensions of a conditioning overturn of expression is so incredibly wild, and that will be defended at all costs. And part of the issue is that the cultivation of the kind of wisdom around what it means to actually protect or defend the overton with wisdom, rather than in a manner that might just be straight from the spirit of subjugation without knowing itself as such. That is, when that starts to become clear to you, it's just all manner of interactions, whether in media or otherwise. We're consistently navigating these dynamics, and appropriately so, of course, appropriately so. So anyway, it feels like somewhat of an artificial place to kind of bring this conversation to a close, just because there's so much richness and ripeness here, and we're coming to the end of what our technical objects can sustain, basically. But how would you like to maybe just share some final words for this dialogue?
Yeah, no, it's definitely difficult to draw these things. We talk about openness all the time. It's like, how are we going to achieve a kind of contingent and provisional closure? And one of the things I would have talked about if we got into interiors and exteriors is my resistance to models of closure, like autopoietic models and different things. That can be for another day. I mean, we're always relatively open, relatively closed.
Absolutely.
We're always modulating that. But we are, in fact, and chemical ecology, again, is a really great illustration of this. We're constitutively open, like we can't completely close ourselves. But, when you mention wisdom, I think one of the key things there is just beginning with signaling ignorance, so you're talking about all of these there are all these complex dynamics. There are so many different constraints that are operative on us. And the key point is that we don't necessarily know what we are being constrained by. We don't necessarily understand our own motivations. We don't necessarily know what we're going to say before we open our mouths. All of this is calling us in some sense to begin with an acknowledgement of the limits of knowledge. That to the extent that we are entering into these kind of reciprocally transformative processes, etc., that we're encountering a limit, which is a limit of our own knowledge. So knowing that I might be constrained by various factors, agencies, contingencies, etc., that are, that I'm not aware of right now, or maybe not aware of altogether, is an important place to begin. And maybe then that also can encourage a kind of compassion. There are a lot of really fraught issues that we've, sort of circumlocuted and maybe could have talked about more. And I will talk about addiction in just a minute to finish off, I think. But, always, like, begin the recognition of one's own ignorance of the particularity of the other and what they're going through, or what it is, or whatever, scale or whatever of otherness we are, of alterity that we're talking about. Recognition of that ignorance can hopefully encourage us to start from a certain level of compassion. Like, I don't understand what animates you and what you're doing, and maybe you don't understand what animates you, but I shouldn't assume that you don't understand what's animating you when I understand what's animating you, so I can fix you because you're being irrational, or whatever it might be. Not starting from there, but still being willing to enter into relations where we perhaps do share some of the, I might have some domain-specific knowledge that's relevant to you, and I want to be able to share that, but we have to cultivate a certain kind of trust. And I have to come from a place of like, I'm hoping this is going to reduce your suffering kind of thing. It's like not, I'm going to mold you in my image because it's going to be easier for me to get on in the world if people are more like me because I'll be less challenged, and it's just more efficient for me, for everyone. And of course, we talk about niche construction, we talk about cultural norms and all of these, and there are like efficiency questions in there. It's like, I don't want to have to expend so much energy thermoregulating, so I'm going to control my environment so that the temperature is relatively constant. I might be using fossil fuels or whatever to do that, etc. But I'm putting the cost somewhere else, not on myself, so I'm less stressed, etc. And I mean, a lot of cultural norms are like that, right? I don't want you to behave in a completely unpredictable way because that's threatening to me. I don't know what you're going to do next, But again, responding to that hopefully from a place of, well, maybe I just don't know where you're coming from, because there's something particular about you which is not subsumed by my worldview, my model, my understanding of humans or whatever. So I think that just speaking to this, there is an imminent limit to our knowledge that we are actually encountering all the time, and just being aware of that. And no matter how much technical understanding you have, no matter how learned you are or whatever, really, I mean, it's kind of a cliche in a sense, but it's like the more you know, the less you know. My experience of deep study of certain areas in which I've developed, expertise has just revealed to me how little I know in general, how ignorant I am, the scale of my ignorance, and in fact, the scale of our ignorance, even in those areas in which I have developed expertise. It's like the things that we don't know about, like, evolution, molecular evolution and chemical ecology and these things, it's like completely mind-blowing. And you can be in contact with that, enough. And actually the internet affords us this capacity. It's one of the quite potentially redemptive things about it, although it's also very frightening to confront your ignorance every day. It's like, whoa. And of course, you can easily become overwhelmed by content. There are healthy and unhealthy ways of coping with this confrontation with ignorance. But being willing to put yourself into that space, sit with that uncertainty, I think is an important thing here. And then this would apply to something like, I often speak in these sorts of conversations in sort of very general terms. I'm like, well, you want to talk about the particularity of all these constraints that are operative on us. But look, maybe it'd be helpful to think about this diagrammatically. So I'm moving it to an abstract level, and I'm saying, look, these are the kinds of dynamics. And over here in chemical ecology, these things are happening, and aren't they, analogous? And that, could potentially be alienating, but or might seem like a move away from what's important. But for me, it's always about bringing these two. It's like being abstract enough and being particular enough and oscillating between these levels, right? So it's like if we just talk about addiction, for example, we can say certain very general things about addiction, and addiction can be a much more general phenomenon than, say, substance abuse, and so addiction is basically being stuck in a pathological basin of attraction, a kind of repetitive compulsion. You keep doing this, it's perseveration, you keep doing the same kind of thing, it's not working, it's damaging your life, blah, 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 but you nonetheless keep engaging in it. I mean, that's a generic definition of addiction. Addictive behavior is that a pattern of behavior which has deleterious consequences, but that you nonetheless continue engaging in. But even there's a certain relativity, or there's a certain particularity that's being masked. Like, who says those things are deleterious? Deleterious by what standard or whatever? And so then we can have a general model of addiction and addictive behaviors, and even, neurotransmitter pathways that are typically involved in substance abuse issues or even, again, more general addictive patterns of behavior. But then when we are thinking about the individual who is suffering from their own repetitive compulsion, there's a certain degree of particularity there that we need to have a certain openness to or faithfulness to if we imagine we could ever help that person. And that applies to ourselves as well. If we think of ourselves as people that we're trying to help, we're trying to generate this insight. It's like, again, I don't know what all of the factors are that led me to have an unhealthy relationship with X substance, behavior, whatever it might be. I need to get curious about that in order to see where I might have more degrees of freedom. And then all the particularities start to pile in. What was of course, there are certain cliches here again. What was your upbringing? You know, what did your parents tell you about this? What does the culture say about that thing that you're in relationship with? Is it perhaps a cultural framing of a thing which makes it more likely for people to enter into unhealthy relationships with it? You know, is there a genetic propensity? So in sort of, you know, biopsychosocial psychology, we would talk about stress diathesis. So stress is like development. It's all the stuff that's particular to your actual lived experience, which has contributed to the development of the pathology or whatever. Diathesis is a genetic propensity, you know. And again, the more we study inheritance, the more we realize how woolly that issue is and how rare a kind of genetic determinism is. But nonetheless, it can be a factor. So I think it's recognizing that there is an irreducible particularity to the reason this particular dynamic is happening, say, for this person, and that we will never reduce that particularity not only to some, you know, generic model, we'll never make the person a generic molecule, but also we will never exhaust their particularity in the sense that we would never be able to just like enumerate it or make a list of all of the factors because they are manifold, they're myriad. So I think these two things are very related to each other for me. It's like, yes, having the schemas and the formalisms and the sort of rationalist side of one's thinking is very important, but then not trying to subjugate what is basically the empirical side, the level at which particularity exists, not trying to subjugate it to those formalisms, but recognizing that in that encounter with what I call prosaic reality, but like empirical reality, firstness, as Charles Sanders Peirce would say, there's, by kind of its very nature, there's something irreducible about it. So there's always this indivisible remainder. For some reason, all the philosophical terms are coming out now, which is a Schelling term. But, you know, that's what, to me, the evolutionary view, the real genuine evolutionary view, when Darwin is putting particularity first, this is how I generalize that. That otherness that is not reducible is something that we're always in contact with. And you talk about attention, like to the extent that we are open to it, and we can't be all the time because you would be overwhelmed, right? But cultivating practices, contexts, etc., and that means setting up the constraints. That's constructing those context-specific constraints such that it is, broadly speaking, safe for you to engage with the raw particularity of lived experience, of prosaic reality. Seems like an important thing to do, is all I'm trying to say.
Awesome. Man, I would love to continue and make a response here, but I have to check on those cameras. The interior, exterior one. Shame to lose that. It is there. Mm-hmm. It is there, threaded in and without there. It is. But thank you, Abe.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.